I knew things were getting serious in Southeast Asia, and I kind of figured my time was up.
And I was sure that the Vietnam War would be over in the next year or so.
You know, this game we're playing out here is for keeps, and these guys have given their full measure, you know.
This is the real thing. And when you pull those triggers to fire machine guns or rockets or 45...
I didn't like the fact that killing became like drinking water.
I don't remember ever actually seeing a body and hitting it. I see flashes out of the woods, and that's what you shoot at.
There was no doubt that 99.9% of the people that graduated from flight school would be destined to go to Vietnam.
In fact, when we lifted up and you tipped the thing down to move forward, blood run down between my feet, pedals.
It didn't seem that it was going to explode, but I learned differently.
It is an ancient country, shrouded in strange traditions and mystery. A place where the past collides with the inevitable onslaught of the modern world. In these bustling streets and the rich green valleys of the countryside, bloody battles once raged. It was the longest American war, the television war, the helicopter war.
During no other time did we apply a technological moniker to an era of conflict. The Revolutionary War and the Civil War weren't known as the Horse War or the Wagon War. Vietnam was synonymous with the helicopter war.
During much of the 1960s and early 1970s, American Huey helicopters filled the skies over Vietnam. The pilots and crews who flew these machines witnessed the most horrific jungle warfare our world has ever seen. Helicopter crews redefined modern warfare in Vietnam. Beyond picking up and dropping off troops and supplies, they created previously unimagined missions for the helicopter in combat. And they supported ground troops from the skies with deadly machine gun and rocket fire. How did they go from being ordinary teenagers to commanding these airborne fighting machines? The proud legacy of military aviation is handed down from senior pilots like father to son.
As I think back from the time I was probably 5, 6 years old, I loved airplanes. To someday be an aviator, a pilot, I mean, it was a dream for me, a passion. And the only way I could get there was to go into the military.
During the 1960s, service in the military most likely meant being sent to Vietnam.
When I was in high school, I worried about whether or not I'd be alive in a year. Because when I was a junior and a senior in high school, the seniors were leaving and joining the Marines and the Army, and we would hear that one of the guys in our class had just been killed in a place in a country we'd never actually heard of. And of course, Vietnam was a televised war, so we were seeing that on TV at night and thinking, you know, in a couple of years, that's where I'm going to be, and that's what I have to look forward to.
People ask me, gee, do you want to go to Vietnam? And you kind of had a cavalier attitude that, well, if you don't make it back, so if you do, I've got, you know, I'm set for the rest of my life, is the way I looked at it, and basically, I am.
My grandmother, who was really like a mother to me, was very, very upset that I was joining the service. But we must remember that was a time when the civil rights movement was very active. So it was almost as fearful being in Mississippi as it was being in Vietnam.
It was also the time of the draft. Young men turned on the evening news to see if their number came up.
I was like everybody else. I was in college. And at that point, they were drafting 125,000 people a month. People forget about that.
I didn't want to be drafted, but I wanted to serve. So I found out that the Army had a program called the Warrant Officer Flight Training Program.
And at this particular point, I was pretty sure I didn't want to go into the infantry, so I figured that the best thing to do was to figure a career that I wanted to go into. But being a 19-year-old kid, as a freshman at Cal Poly Pomona, I decided, well, maybe I'll try something different, get a little adventure in my life.
And I applied, went through about a 3 or 4 month process, and next thing I know, I was enlisting to go to basic training, and a couple months later, I was in Army flight training.
And at that particular point, it was 1966, and I was sure that the Vietnam War would be over in the next year or so. It didn't seem that it was going to explode, but I learned differently.
In the Korean War, the helicopter had proved itself a valuable tool as an air ambulance. At the beginning of the Vietnam War, the helicopter again was thought of only in terms of medical evacuation. But with the advent of new technology, most notably the turbine engine, the helicopter became more versatile. A more powerful and faster helicopter meant a new way of looking at air warfare. Helicopters could airlift men into battle, then provide close-in support with machine guns, mortars, and rockets. The Army's old cavalry had found a replacement for the horse. Now all that was needed was someone to fly these new helicopters. Early in the Vietnam War, there were two types of pilots: young men new to the armed services and career soldiers. The lifers, as they are called, had fought in World War II in Korea. They saw the helicopter as a new technology that would renovate military tactics and revitalize their careers.
Well, when Korea was over with and everybody came home, I had my tour in Korea right after it was over with. Come back to Fort Lewis, and a lot of NCOs, you know, and I'm sitting there, the low-ranking man in an ordnance supply shop, and doing all the work, seemed like to me. And all these ranking NCOs sitting around, and I thought, well, you know, I'm not going to go anywhere unless I do something. And we were right across from Gray Army Airfield, so one day at lunch I wandered over there and talked to one of the W-1s that was flying H-13s. He took me for a ride, and he said, why don't you apply for flight school? They're begging them. So I did. And probably the best move I ever made.
Some of the younger pilots weren't only new to the military, they had never been near an aircraft.
I had never flown before in my life. In fact, the first time I ever got on an airplane was going down to basic training in Fort Polk, Louisiana. So I had no idea what I was in for, what I did, until I got there.
None of these men were sure what to expect from themselves or each other as air crews in combat.
I grew up with an influence. It was, you know, the American flag, mom's apple pie, and then the war stories from the uncles, you know, John Wayne and Hopalong Cassidy and Gene Autry were my heroes. I'm really dating myself. In 1966, when I got orders to go to Vietnam, I was actually excited.
The Army hoped that their spirit and commitment to each other would save lives in combat, because the war in Vietnam would be bloody and costly. Of the more than 58,000 Americans to lose their lives in Vietnam, 4,339 were helicopter crew members. When we return, new pilots discover learning to fly is much harder than it looks. To be accepted into Army flight school during the 1960s, there was a series of boards and exams to pass, including physical, psychological, and flight aptitude tests. A minimum age of 18 and 2 years college was required. The tough lessons of physical fitness and basic training that worked on the ground would be invaluable in the air.
Yeah, it was 9 weeks at the time that I went through. Then you loaded on the buses and headed up to Fort Walters, Texas, and into flight school. And that was a rude awakening once you get to Fort Walters, believe me.
Fort Walters, Texas. It was here pilot trainees got their first feel for flight.
It was very fast-paced. The Army was pushing the pilots through as quickly as they could, so the training was very quick. And you had to catch on to what was going on. And fortunately for us, they had some really incredible flight instructors that helped us get through it all.
Ground school taught the basic principles of flight and how a helicopter works. Understanding aircraft systems was essential to becoming a good pilot. Army training films helped make the flight characteristics of the helicopter seem simple.
In spite of how complicated helicopters are, the controls are quite simple, really. The cyclic here actually controls the direction of the helicopter. You tilt it forward, the machine goes forward. When you go side to side, it does exactly what you hope, and you can back up with this by pulling it back. The pedals control the tail rotor and determine the direction of the nose of the ship. This is called the collective. When you want to pick a ship up to a hover or climb, you pull this up, which controls pitch in the main rotor system. When you add pitch, you also have to add power. And there is a motorcycle type grip here that actually is the throttle control. Now, it's very tricky at first to figure out that all of these work together. When you add power, the torque changes, and you have to make an adjustment in the pedals. If you make a change in the cyclic, you have to make a change in all the other controls.
Most people eventually got it. Some had a tougher time.
The old timers that were coming back were the ones that were having the hardest time, the people that couldn't adjust to the rigors of officer training. A lot of the former NCOs that were coming in there, and they were being pushed and shoved and yelled at, and they really had a hard time adjusting. So most of the guys were weeded out in pre-flight that were going to have a hard time in officer training.
I was doing the best I could, you know, but I sweated it out, you know.
If you failed any 3 exams, written exams, you were automatically washed out of school. And then they told us that we would be heading to the infantry. And while I had nothing but admiration for the infantry, I didn't want to be on the ground. I just wanted to fly.
Most flight instructors were veteran pilots who had already seen action in Vietnam. Usually the Army would have pilots do 1 tour in combat and 2 years of teaching at flight school. Their job was not only to teach the new pilots how to fly, but how to stay alive in combat. In Vietnam, 1 helicopter would be lost for every 8 missions flown.
When I came back, I was a flight instructor at Fort Walters. That was probably more terrifying than Vietnam, trying to teach new pilots how to fly.
Flight training was taught in 2 phases. In the first, students learned the basics of helicopter flying. Mornings found teachers and students doing ground school in classrooms. Afternoons meant flying. Out on the flight line, pilots would pre-flight their aircraft, then fly them to staging fields where hands-on training was conducted. It's here they mastered their first skill. They learned to hover.
They would take you out in the middle of a field and just study the aircraft there and say, you know, just hold it right here. Just grab the controls and hold it. I think the first control that I was given to me was the cyclic. Try to stick this stick straight up in the aircraft, and you just start going back and forth, start swaying back and forth. And pretty soon they had to take it or you'd crash.
I was probably the worst helicopter student they had. I was all over that training area from one end to the other, and probably scaring my flight instructor to death as well as myself. I got to where I was afraid to go out to the flight line because the aircraft was controlling me. I had no control over it whatsoever.
My first day of flying, I said, this may not be my profession.
And I think in the back of your mind, you always had a feeling like, oh, what if I wash out? But you don't really feel like it's gonna happen.
You go through Fort Walters, you know, it wasn't unusual to be bounced out, and I thought it was pretty tough myself. Of course, I might be a little bit more simple than the other guys were.
I think the instructors, as well as the other cadets, were extremely helpful getting through the course. Of course, I mean, you're so focused there while you're there. I mean, the academics as well as the flying is so concentrated until you don't have time to really start analyzing, you know, the good and bad of it all. You're just simply trying to make it through the next day and make sure that the people around you are making it.
Not long after getting the hang of holding a helicopter steady, pilots were faced with another daunting task.
I never thought that I was prepared to solo.
I think they set our solo program up. I think they were looking for you to solo about 10 hours. I don't recall anybody in our class doing a less than 10. I think the average was around 12, and I think I was right there around 12 or 13.
I couldn't believe it when my flight instructor said, candidate, because I was a warrant officer candidate, candidate Lasser, well, I'm going to cut you loose. It's against my better judgment.
You got it, you know.
We'll see you back in about an hour.
I was scared to death, but I guess the training just comes into play and it just picks up, and pretty soon you realize it. You, particularly after the first trip around, I mean, that's the most exhilarating thing that can happen to you. And about that third time around, though, you can sort of look out and make sure that everybody's seeing that you're soloing.
Much to his surprise, I came back in about an hour.
You know, that first day you solo, you're proud as hell. I was, anyway.
Once you soloed, then they brought you back to the Holiday Inn at the time and threw you into the pool.
I didn't make it to the hotel pool. I got into a muddy pond with another guy, I think.
The second phase of flight training, which brought pilots one step closer to their wings and to Vietnam, took place at Fort Rucker, Alabama.
Well, once we got out of Fort Walters, I think the scariest part for most of us was to hear the horror stories about our first 4 weeks there, which would have been time and instrument training.
In this phase of training, students learned to fly without looking outside the aircraft. The pilots wore a device called a hood, which restricted their vision and forced them to fly by instruments alone.
Boy, you'll never forget that. The first day you're out with your instrument instructor, and he puts that hood on you. Then you pick the helicopter up to a hover under the hood and you take off. And an hour later, you get down to about 10 feet off the ground and they take the hood off you. And this whole time you'd been flying, you don't know where you've been flying. All you know is you flew a bunch of lines and then listened to a bunch of people on the radio, and you got back to where you were supposed to be, but it was all under the instruments. And I'll tell you, that, of all my experience, I think that was the hardest month I ever spent in my life.
But just being a good pilot wasn't enough to fly in combat. Pilots also became proficient at technical maneuvers and field operations. Learning to fly the larger Huey and learning all its emergency procedures was next. This was the aircraft they would fly in combat. Vietnam was getting closer.
Just the prospect of going in the Huey transition and really flying the big bird, so to speak, was quite exciting for all of us, and we were all looking forward to that. We all saw the Huey sitting there. Every time it cranked up to go somewhere, everybody was just oogle-eyeing the thing and just couldn't wait to get in that thing and start actually flying.
Flying the Huey helicopter at Fort Rucker, the first thing I think one realized in flying the Huey is how big it is compared to the Hiller. It was definitely the Cadillac of helicopters at that time when we got there.
Besides the pilots, another important member of these helicopter crews was trained at Fort Rucker. Crew chiefs, the men who maintained the helicopter and cared for the aircraft in the field, were there. Gunnery training and all onboard safety procedures were taught.
The amount of training they gave you was you go out and spend one day they'd actually have you on a tower where you would shoot, learn how to operate the weapon, and then the next day they'd take you up in a helicopter and see if you could hit anything while you were moving. So yeah, it was all new. You get the real short course once you get there. So.
There was escape and evasion training, a course in survival skills that could save aircrew lives if they were shot down.
Yeah, sure. We killed the chicken and ate the snake.
Escape and evasion, that was probably the most humorous thing I did, was the escape and evasion course.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun in escape and evasion training. It was the same thing. You just go out in the middle of the night and there's going to be guys out there to catch you, and you're supposed to go from point A to point B. There's 5 or 6 of us together. I don't know what we did, but we walked for hours and it seemed like we were going in circles, and then finally daybreak came. Somebody found us and pointed down there is where you're supposed to be. We walked in. So we never got caught, and to this day I don't even know where we were in the mountains. So I suppose if I ever was lost out in the jungle, I'd probably still be there.
Looking back on it, what a hoot.
Most pilots didn't take the training too seriously. To accept that these skills were needed was to believe in the possibility of being shot down.
The next step was to spend a week out processing and get ready to graduate.
Between 1965 and 1973, Fort Rucker Army Flight School trained over 27,000 helicopter pilots.
I remember the Humus parts versus the series parts, but everything, there was a foreboding as we got closer to graduation where the humor was kind of quiet, and everybody was waiting to get their wings and their warrant and get on with business.
A year of the best flight training in the world instilled confidence in the young men. Nearly all graduates of these classes, these new Army aviators, would wind up in Southeast Asia.
There might have been 200 in the class. I think 97% of us went to Vietnam.
They had 30 days to think about it, 30 days of leave, time for some last goodbyes before they shipped out for Vietnam.
It was kind of like you were walking around with a kind of a cloud over your head, because you were kind of knowing that in 30 days you're going to have to go to war. And I'm going, I could be dead pretty soon. I could not live through this. And all of a sudden here I am, this 20-year-old kid, and I'm going, what have I gotten myself into? And then finally you just have to like swallow your panic here and then realize that, okay, you've got an adventure ahead of you.
My father believes that every young person in the United States should spend a little bit of time in the military. So he was worried that I might get killed in Vietnam, but on the other hand, he felt that it was something that I needed to do and that he respected.
I had made peace with, hey, I'm a soldier and I'm going to go fly a helicopter in Vietnam.
When we continue, young pilots try to grasp their new role in the shadow of a confusing war.
I had made peace with, hey, I'm a soldier and I'm going to go fly a helicopter in Vietnam.
Days later, we're in Vietnam. And about a day out of Vietnam, you start preparing the packs, what is called a transport pack, a big pack where you carry all of your equipment and so forth, to land on the beach. Now, we all prepare for this. We have the helmets on and so forth, and then we cruise into Quin Nhân Bay. Quin Nhân Bay was like cruising into San Diego.
I don't know what I was expecting. I look back on it. Were we going to land, and was there going to be a firefight on the tarmac, and we were going to low crawl into an armored personnel carrier and be dragged off to a bunker? We landed, and a bus rolled up, and some sergeant says, "Get your buns off the airplane and get in the bus." And we got in the bus. The only thing different was that the bus had chicken wire on the windows.
You've got a chain link fence on the side of the bus, and you're going like, is that for what? And they said, basically, well, apparently they throw hand grenades at the bus.
But other than humidity and the chicken wire on the bus, I could have been back in Alabama for all intents and purposes.
And all you were doing is going, what am I supposed to do now? Where am I supposed to go? So you're wondering where you're supposed to go, and you have orders. I had orders for the 9th Division. Well, what they do is they don't do that. They come in and they tell you, well, we need 3 pilots over here, we need 2 pilots over here, we need 10 pilots over here, and they just pull your name. So, and if you say, gee, I really want to go to this particular unit, you probably would get it, but hey, I was so green, I didn't know where I was at. So it was just whatever you want, just take me.
They threw me in the back of a C-130, and I wound up at a place called Queen Yan, and then trucked out to a base camp called Ansong, where the 14th Aviation Battalion was at.
Now they were in country. For the first time, the helicopter crews had a look at the terrain that for the next year would be their combat proving ground. Flight school hadn't prepared them for the intense heat and humidity, and the enormous jungle.
When we got to Vietnam, we could now see the terrain. We could get familiar with the terrain as well as the climate over there. You had, of course, 50 over 100,000 maps to look at and familiarize yourself with things that would get you back in cases of emergencies, particularly if you were in IFR conditions or instrument flying conditions. We also got to learn the other bases around within our area of operation.
In Vietnam, American military personnel were housed in huts called hooches. The pilots who served in Vietnam remember their first night in this strange and exotic land. Mostly, it was terrifying.
The first night we got mortared. So, I mean, not a couple mortar rounds, but as far as a new person in country, that was combat. And I remember cowering under my bunk, shaking as about 7 or 8 mortar rounds went out, then the all clear sounded. That was my welcome. And then the next day, more in processing. I was given another guy who'd been there a while showing me around where the supply room was. They gave me a pistol, but then somebody gave me an M16, and I accidentally fired it off in the hooch, put a hole in the floor, and they took the M16 away from me and said, "You're a helicopter pilot, you don't need an automatic weapon." I said, "Okay."
In the hooch, each man was assigned a cubicle big enough for a bunk, a footlocker, and some token privacy.
Nothing very elaborate, but at least you had a bed, and you had a shower, and you could clean up, and guys would build extra little platforms to sunbathe on and so forth.
A hooch one man short had an extra cubicle that could be used as a bar, library, and pilot-ready room.
And you had to have a sound system, and I wasn't any different. And I had it all set up in this place that was going to destroy it with all the heat and humidity.
The first unit I was in, I had a hooch mate that was a big country fan, and all he had was a Merle Haggard tape, and it drove me crazy. And I bought a stereo that was bigger and louder than his, and I bought the Jimi Hendrix Experience. And every time I hear it, I flash back to this poor kid from Utah just going nuts.
There were so many different characters, personalities, the typical collage of the military, the tall guy, the guy from Alabama, the New York guy, the Italian fellow, typical Army melting pot.
Then there were the hooch maids, local women who did housekeeping and boot shining for pilots who cared about spit and polish. To some of the pilots, these women seemed to take the place of girlfriend or mom. Sometimes both. No one ever knew, though, how many of these women were communist sympathizers. Regardless of the assignment, the reality of war in Vietnam was well beyond what any of these young air crews had imagined.
Well, let me tell you that when you're the new guy over in Vietnam, they called you the FNG, and I'll just tell you that it might have stood for Fine New Guy, but and you were very inexperienced and scared. There are people trying to kill you, and of course, when you're 20 years old, you feel invincible, but you're still scared, nervous. And I was lucky. I flew in a company called the Hornets, the 116th Assault Helicopter Company, and we had some pilots there that were just wonderful pilots. And I thought I knew a lot from flight school, but when I got to Vietnam, I realized that there was a whole lot I didn't know. In Vietnam, the air temperature is hot, it's humid, and we're carrying very heavy loads, which is the name of the game in combat. And the helicopter operates very sluggishly in those types of environments. And I know my first week over there, I was flying in the co-pilot seat, and the aircraft commander let me fly the machine. We got down into a rice paddy with about 8 of our aircraft almost meshing rotor blades, and I lost tail rotor effectiveness, and the aircraft started to yaw very badly towards another aircraft, and my aircraft commander saw what was happening and immediately knew we had to reduce power to get control of the machine. I didn't know that. We'd never even talked about loss of tail rotor effectiveness in flight school, and we'd never operated in those kind of conditions. And this guy knew exactly what was going on, was able to grab the aircraft and show me what was happening. And boy, I learned a lot that day.
Yeah, I thought I was pretty hot stuff, only to find out that I was the new guy on the block, cannon fodder for the new unit I was in, the 161st. Only to be humbled by the guys that had been there a couple months more than I had who had the war stories and were aircraft commanders, and there was a little ritual you went through as the new guy. Nothing humiliating like a fraternity type of hazing, but a little bit, enough to let you know that, hey, just because you got your wings, you aren't a real aviator, Army aviator yet. There was an adage that you were always training your replacement. And the guy that was a year older than you and maybe had been there 5 or 6 months, was an aircraft commander, and you learned from him. And you were taught to learn the good habits and ignore the bad habits. But this guy was going to show you the flight planning, the mission planning, the routes, the radio calls, and things like that, until it was your time to take a check flight, then move over to the aircraft commander seat.
The job was called aircraft commander. It was the final rite of passage for a new pilot. It could take up to 300 hours of combat flight time to qualify to become an AC, and it brought many new responsibilities. In order to make the grade, in many units, every aircraft commander in a platoon had to vote unanimously to put a pilot in the coveted left seat.
And probably one of the traditions in Vietnam was when you made pilot in command of your aircraft, it was kind of like an initiation. You were brought up to that level of this big exalted leader of pilot in command of your own aircraft. As I remember, it was during the monsoonal season, and we had little catwalks that we walked around and little trenches that went between the compound to have the water run off. And I remembered my initiation was getting thrown in this one of these channels and coming out looking like some kind of mud mummy, and I actually they have a picture of it that I still have today in my scrapbook.
Non-combat time was spent eating, drinking, and trying to relax. Their home movies give an insider's view of how crews passed the time waiting for the next fight.
Well, when we first went in the country, we had an immaculate officer club. I mean, so many funny things happen in the officers club. We could sit up there, and we had the long bar, and you could look out the huge glass window out, and you could see the war going on outside.
And we had our own little pet monkey. Somebody taught it to smoke cigarettes, and the monkey was just up no good all the time. I mean, he would go in there, he'd pilfer cigarettes, and it was just incredible things this monkey did to people that weren't ready for it.
We always had roast beef. We'd have roast beef for breakfast, roast beef for lunch, roast beef for dinner, striped roast beef, boiled roast beef, pounded roast beef, purple roast beef spaghetti. And after I came back, my mom asked me what I wanted for dinner, and I told her I wanted some expletive pork chops.
And you'd see guys, I mean, a lot of guys drink a little bit, maybe a little bit more than you'd see people playing dice, fights, all the whole thing. But pretty nice. When we went up to Bang Sang, when we moved north, a place called Bang Sang, we had sort of a wooden frame with a tent cover over the top. And I've never drank. I didn't even drink in Vietnam. So I was in there an awful lot, but did not do any drinking. But there were some that, would drink quite a bit.
God help you if you're drunk and passed out, because there's some pictures of you and the monkey that you don't want anybody to see.
As with all wars, the waiting was tough on everyone. Every pilot knew combat was just around the corner, but when?
Yeah, the waiting around issue was kind of always created a lot of anxiety, and it didn't matter what you were doing. you knew something was going on, and you knew something was going to have to happen. But the waiting around's part of the Army, so you kind of get used to that.
I felt homesick from the standpoint that if we were not actively engaged, then you had time to start thinking about home. And I think that if we were not in action, once we began our operations, if we did not do something within 3 or 4 days, I began to get very, very nervous.
When the chance to fly came, pilots and crews were given assignments based on military need.
First I went up to Fuloy, which is about 30 miles north of Saigon. And amazed I can sort of remember all the names. And I was in the 128th Assault Company, and I was a slick driver. The Tomahawks, it was Tomahawk 2-0.
Many crews were given the task of troop transport. They used Huey aircraft stripped of all but 2 defensive M60 machine guns. They were nicknamed Slicks. They could carry 6 fully armed American troops or up to 10 of the smaller Vietnamese soldiers. Other crews flew heavily armed gunships that would seek out the enemy and fire deadly ordnance down from the sky. When we continue, the realities of war sink in as the new pilots come under fire. In Vietnam, Huey helicopters had 4 crew members: the aircraft commander, co-pilot, crew chief, and door gunner. The pilot and co-pilot were in charge, but it was the crew chief who kept the machines in the air. The pilots only flew it. The Army trained 46,000 crew chiefs between 1965 and 1973. Along with the door gunner, they made sure the aircraft was always in flyable condition.
The flight engineer crew chief always got there early, and they were the last guys to leave. And the absolute last guy to leave the aircraft was the gunner, because he had to clean all the weapons afterward.
Sometimes the crew chief and door gunner would work all night repairing battle damage, then bleary-eyed fly all the combat missions the next day. A typical day of combat could mean 8 to 15 hours of flight time. The importance of a tight crew could not be overstated.
The door gunner and the crew chief that you had, I would think saved, in my case, our lives many, many times. When we were down there, we oftentimes, and believe me, this is something that many other crews did, we would hover over the enemy and be firing. And that was just sort of a common thing, and they'd be everywhere. They'd be everywhere. And they'd be shooting at you. I mean, you get, the aircraft would just be full of holes.
Some enlisted crew members even learned to fly, so they could bring an aircraft home if both pilots were wounded or dead.
I had one time toyed with the idea of going to flight school myself, and I had a great admiration. I enjoyed flying an awful lot. I trusted the pilots. You had to, but they were great.
A door gunner completed the team. They manned one of the ship's M60 machine guns, protecting the rear quarter on their side of the ship.
I was pretty impressed with how accurate our gunners were with their M60 machine guns. They could, Vietnam is covered with craters that were blue in color. The water would fill these craters and it'd be a real pretty turquoise. And we'd be, 800 feet or 500 feet or whatever. And a door gunner, a good door gunner, could take that M60 and fire one quick round and hit that water in the center of a crater. And boy, they were good on those machine guns. Let me tell you, they saved our bacon many times.
I prided myself on being able to be on target by the second tracer round, which is flying at 100 miles an hour is not bad. At least I thought. That's every 5th round is a tracer. I see flashes out of the woods, and that's what you shoot at. And I guess really in the back of your mind, I don't think of it as a body down there trying to shoot me. It's a target. And I guess that's how I got around it. It wasn't like I was shooting another human being. I was just shooting at a target.
No one forgets the first time the bullets started flying.
You can always tell the new guys when they get to Vietnam, they would put their seat up as high as they could get it so they could see everything that was going on. After the first combat assault and when the shooting starts, they get They put the seat down as low as they can get it so they can hide behind the instrument panel. I was in an aircraft climbing out. We just dropped off a load of troops, and we were leaving the area, and probably about 1,000 foot climbing, and a bullet hit the bottom of the aircraft, and it made a tremendous sound. It hit a case of a machine gun bullet case in the back that had C rations in it, and when it hit, it bounced up, came back down on the floor, and it made a huge noise, and the aircraft shook and yawed, and that was from me jumping when the bullet hit. Turned out later it was a very small caliber round, but it came up through the back and went right under the seat that sits in front of the transmission and on the transmission deck there.
There's no such thing as an armored helicopter. It's a weight to power ratio type of flying machine, and the only protected parts on the aircraft are around the pilots in ceramic seats that don't go all the way around. But if you'll notice, this is standard gauge aircraft aluminum, and with some simple rivets. You can push a pencil through here, and that's what the remainder of the aircraft is made of. A round would go through an aircraft and clang around. And if it hit the ceramic seat, it could bounce off that ceramic seat, not bury itself in there and come back out. It could go through the roof, out through the rotor system, hit the rotor system, because everything was so thin. A lot of times guys would take, the pilot would wear a chicken vest, a ceramic vest, we'd called it a chicken vest, and some kind of armor or another vest he'd put underneath the seat to protect immediately under the legs, right behind the cyclic, as it turned out. But that was it as far as protection. And you were out there hanging out all by yourself. Your crew chief was even more vulnerable because he didn't have an armored seat. He was just hanging over the gun along with the gunner, exposed to everybody and everything.
It was a night mission. We were called out, and we were sitting up, everybody, you know, at the club, overlooking the scenery, beautiful scenery of Vietnam, and a unit made contact, and we were the emergency crew for that evening. So we immediately ran down to the airstrip, jump in the aircrafts and take off, and we head out to this area, and there's something called a forward air observer, a fact, that is directing us into the position to fire upon the enemy, and they would fire white phosphorus grenades where they thought the enemy would be. And we did this, made the contact, and then rolled in on the enemy position, fired up on it, and as what was happening as we began to fire upon it, these tracer rounds began to come back up at us. And that's one of the most frightening things you can see. Those things honestly look as big as basketballs coming at you, because it seemed as they passed you, they got larger. Just coming past you. Well, and then, scared, very scared. Pull up, pull more power than we should have pulled, went into a cloud, totally lost, had no idea where the other aircraft was. Everybody's screaming and hollering, "Where are you, where are you?" And just totally chaotic. It was unbelievably bad.
The most important deployment of Hueys was in flights of 4 to 15 slicks loaded with troops. This was called a combat assault.
We would pick up the troops in the morning and fly them out to the combat area.
They were Marine Corps A4s dropping ordnance in.
The landing zone, or LZ, was the targeted drop zone, where the flight would land and offload their troops.
And I was in a V of 3 in a 15-ship lift, battalion lift.
We had gunships that would escort us out and drop in and strafe the landing area.
And I can see the LZ way out in front of me, and it was quiet, kind of your routine combat assault. And all of a sudden, the LZ got hot.
The gunship pilot called our control ship and said, "Hey, be advised that there's extreme hot fire in this LZ, and that slick will get in, but we don't think he's going to get out."
And then we lost 2 aircraft on the first lift. Second VA-3 landed, we lost another aircraft. And I was screaming on the radio, bullets flying, I see ricochets and stuff. And I'm tail end Charlie, looking at this LZ, waiting for the command and control aircraft to call it off. The next VA-3 went in there, received fire, took hits, but they got out. And by the time we landed, it was all over. But I was more scared then because I heard it and saw it. Fear just, I had this, when I got scared over there was this knot in my stomach, this funny knot in my stomach, and I had that the whole time, and I was so relieved afterwards because I was really scared.
When we return, tough flying conditions and non-stop killing takes a toll as Vietnam helicopter crews come to know their enemy. During the late 60s, more troops, supplies, and helicopter units were sent to Vietnam to stop the continuing advance of communist forces. In this sea of uncertainty, helicopter crews had to deal with multiple challenges, from being shot at to simply getting their heavy aircraft off the ground.
Yeah, when you initially begin flying in Vietnam, particularly with the weather, humidity, et cetera, and the density altitude that you were dealing with, what you realize is that you don't have a lot of power. So many times what we do is go bouncing down the runway, sort of skidded, dropping as we go down the runway until we can get up enough airlift, if you will, to take off. And there have been times when we'd have the crew chief and the gunner run along beside the aircraft until we got airborne, and they'd jump on it.
The small Hughes helicopter was called a Loach, or light observation ship. Even armed, it was mainly utilized as a scout aircraft. Gunships at first were regular B and C model Hueys with rocket pods, miniguns, and mortar cannons. In this configuration, Army pilots became deadly accurate and could deliver punishing close-in support for the ground troops. Then Bell Helicopter took the running gear of a Huey and developed the Cobra gunship. Barely wide enough for the pilots, it was sleek, fast, and deadly. The Cobra made its first combat appearance in late 1967. Together with their small scout Loaches, these two aircraft became known as hunter-killer teams.
We normally did the hunter-killer team when we were simply looking for the enemy and did not have an idea where he was.
The normal routine would be I'd fly down at about 5-10 feet off the ground, and you're looking for flags, and you're looking for footprints, and you're looking for signs, and the Cobra would just circle around me, and they'd always keep me in sight. So whenever I took fire, the Cobra would respond. As soon as I took fire, we'd pop smoke and get out of the way. All I had was an observer on board with an AR-15, and we would usually carry about 15 or 20 hand grenades piled between us, all different kinds. We have thermite grenades, we have concussion grenades. If we were chasing guys that were in the river, they'd hide in the river and we drop concussion grenades in the river. Then in the Cobra, we had an electric machine gun, minigun.
Could take the miniguns and fire within 4 feet of people on the ground. The rockets were, you have to be a little bit more careful with the rockets. But the miniguns, we had the sight where you could look right into a trench line and just go right down that trench line, firing on people. So the miniguns was by far the most exciting weapon.
When you're flying guns, you're out looking for the bad guys, and we found them. They were easy to find. And, I was amazed at how our gun pilots, our aircraft commanders, how accurate they were with their rockets and miniguns, and how much devastation a Huey gunship can actually deliver. They're a very lethal weapon in the right hands. You can't believe the destruction they can cause.
Some of the missions were a reminder of just how vulnerable a helicopter is in combat.
One of our missions over there, which was a big one, we recovered aircraft when they were shot down or they had mechanical difficulties and whatnot. In other words, we tried not to leave them in the field or destroy them.
That was probably one of the most important missions, recovery missions. The only bad part was that you often thought in your mind, why'd it go down? Who was the bad guy down there that hurt this flying machine that I have to go in there and sling load it out?
On those missions, we carried another crew member, a gunner, and he had a gun on the ramp. For a while, we surprised some folks, and the rear gunner there was able to inflict some casualties on the enemy. And then, of course, they got smart to that too, and then they would tend to leave us alone unless it was just too good a shot, you know.
Other missions were a bit more bizarre.
When you went to an outpost, you carried live animals with you, and a lot of times we had self-generated parachutes for them so that we would have to throw them out live and hope that the parachute held them enough, the cows or the pigs and what have you. Chickens, we merely free-fall them. We let them get out, and it was rather ironic to see them when they did go out. They would start flying for about the first 10 seconds, and then they just fold their wings up and spiral on in like a bomb.
We conducted in the cab quite a few artillery raids, they'd call them, where they take 5 or 6 Chinooks and a gun and the ammo underneath it. And they would secure an LZ, and we'd take the artillery unit and drop it off and go back and pick them up after they fired all different directions. And they confused Charlie because they would think that they were working that area, and most times they booby trapped the LZ, and when Charlie go try to get in there that night where they'd, find they were gone. As far as I'm concerned, two of the best airplanes the Army ever bought was the Chinook and the Huey, and they proved it in Vietnam.
Death was a constant, sobering companion. Every helicopter crewman had his own way of dealing with it.
But it is an awesome feeling, indescribable, really. It's horror and terror and of knowing you just killed someone. Was that person married? Did they have a family? Those types of things. And there were guys that didn't care. Guys that didn't. But again, they were far and few between. Most of the people I was associated with, we did not hesitate to do our job. We did not hesitate to do whatever had to be done to protect our troops.
I think one of the strange transitions we went through over there is getting used to the dying all around you. At first, my guess is that we actually just pretended like it didn't affect us so that we could get through the missions and get through the day. At some point, it actually stopped bothering you and you just more or less became numb. While you could still see the death and the dying, you just had to fly. You just had to keep your stuff together and get through the day.
I didn't like the fact that killing became like drinking water. It was absolutely nothing except another thing to do. There was no sorrow. From my standpoint then, about 30 days or so, once you're out of that environment, you start looking in the mirror to find, is this really me? It means nothing unless it's your friend, your buddy, an American, or something like that, an ally. But in firing upon the enemy, there was no remorse whatsoever, and I think that's the worst in all of us.
B-52s carpet-bombed hundreds of tons of high explosives on known Viet Cong tunnel positions. Shortly after this devastation, patrols or scout aircraft moved into the area to do damage assessment. Amazingly, these tough enemy soldiers would crawl immediately back out of their tunnels and return fire. Most American fighting men had a great deal of respect for the sheer guts of the Viet Cong.
The Vietnamese soldier was a very tenacious militiaman, and a lot from the same stock as we were 224 years ago when we fought our Revolutionary War. Now, I didn't want to lose any war, and I was there. I wanted to be the victor and not the loser. But he didn't go home after a year. He was in for the duration. I got to go home after a year, and so did everybody else that made it through. But a very tenacious, smart jungle fighter.
If you, say, are an ammo bearer and you walk all the way from North Vietnam down there with 3 or 4 shells on your back, and a guy chunks them, and you stand there and watch it, you don't have to go back and get more. You got to be devoted to the cause. You got to be, how do you want to say it? Believe in what you're doing, I think they were the same as most of the GIs that went over there. You know, you're told to do a job. You know, you're in their country.
And you're not going to win a war when a person has that kind of tenacity and devotion. I don't have any antagonism or disrespect or hatred for the NVA or the VC right now. I think they did what they had to do, and it was unfortunate for them. They lost a lot more people than we did.
Matter of fact, we had a couple guys in the unit that would refer to the Viet Cong as Sir Charles, because the phonetic call sign was Victor Charlie, so a lot of people called him Charlie. We had a couple guys after a certain experience or something where they did something very smart or whatever, or our guys were impressed with, would refer to them as Sir Charles or Mr. Charles.
The North Vietnamese Army was dedicated, disciplined, and highly trained.
The VC and North Vietnamese, they knew how far these guns on the right and left would traverse back. So they would leave us alone until we were pulling up out of the pickup zone. Then they would even just step out into the clearing and shoot at the aft of the helicopter, which that's most vulnerable back there. Your engines, transmissions, hydraulics, and everything stem from there.
The Americans at the end of World War II betrayed Ho Chi Minh when his homeland was handed back to the French instead of his countrymen as promised. The people of North Vietnam followed Ho with unwavering and zealous allegiance. With their revered leader espousing hatred of the Americans, the NVA were fierce. Their commitment to their cause was total.
We mostly were fighting with the NVA, that was mainly down in the Delta area. And so they would come in and they'd put up banners and flags and all kinds of stuff and barricade trails. And I don't know why they would do that, but it was almost like 100% like, here I am.
The Viet Cong, or Vietnamese Communist guerrillas, were a separate enemy fighting force. Much like resistance fighters, they were not as well trained, but even more highly motivated.
With the VC, it was one guy at a time, or a girl, or a kid, and that was the most difficult because the NVA had uniforms on everything, but the VC could be anywhere. You know, everybody tells stories of flying around and a young 15-year-old girl is in the rice paddy with an oxen, and next thing you know, she pulls out an AK and shoots at you. I saw that. And in fact, it wasn't all that unusual. So what the difficult thing was, and a lot of people don't understand that since wars are fought by basically kids, you had a bunch of 20-year-old helicopter pilots, scouts like me, that had to make some incredible decisions. And I think this was the most difficult part of flying a helicopter, because you really couldn't put your finger on who was who. And I think these are the things that bother you these days. You feel like you made the right decisions, but did you make the right decisions?
Let's face it, you're in combat. So in a combat situation, yes, your life is at risk, and everyone around you is also. So you better be able to figure out real quick who the good guys are, who the bad guys are.
There was a lot of them that were, I'm sure, trained by the Americans, you know, because we had one that stood there after a mortar attack one night and looked at the sergeant and said, "You know me, Sergeant, you trained me, you know. You trained me how to fire a mortar, you know me." He said, "Yeah, I know you."
When we return, the war America thought it was winning turns into a political nightmare during a surprise Vietnamese attack called the Tet Offensive.
There's something about war, as bad as it is, that brings out the best and the worst in us. And I think we always try to seek that best in us. We, in many ways, love war. And it may very well go for women too. I just only deal with it from a male perspective. There is something very exciting about war, taking that ultimate risk. Yes, you enjoy it because it's you against them, and you putting everything on the line. Yes.
Late January 1968, Most Americans believe the war in Vietnam is well under control. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong were about to change all that. In conjunction with Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the most important holiday in Vietnam, Communist forces launched a major offensive in cities across the southern half of the country.
It started about 3 o'clock in the morning when it looked like D-Day. The skies were nothing but tracer rounds and incoming rounds and rockets and mortars, and they hit Phu Loy where we were at pretty hard because we had quite a few helicopter units there. Things were happening so quickly and there was so much going on, and they said, well, the VC had come in over around Saigon the night before, and the only place that we can get troops in and we're going to have to fight our way out of the city is to bring troops into the middle of the city and fight their way back out.
It was called the Tet Offensive. It entirely changed the course of the war in Vietnam.
And so 10 ships at a time flew into the Phu To racetrack, which is a racetrack right in the west side of town. And the whole time there was nothing but apartment buildings, and I mean, it looks like you're right in the middle of Los Angeles, only there's a big racetrack there.
NVA and Viet Cong forces had quietly amassed arms and ammunition. Then they attacked on several fronts at once, taking complete control of 7 major cities and many provinces.
And so we flew in there and we were taking shots and fire out of apartments and buildings, and you could look out and look right inside of a window. And we landed in there, so we ran the first troops into Saigon in Tet, and that was like in the morning. Then we went up to the west side and Xuan Loc, and it went all the way to 3 o'clock in the morning, and so it was like about a 15-hour day of just nothing but flying. And then we went back to Phu Loy and slept for a few hours.
By February 10th, Allied forces had regained all lost ground. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army losses in those 13 days equal the total number of American dead for the entire war. But the damage had been done. How could a war that was supposedly under control get so out of hand?
The Tet offensive of the communists in 1968, from an operational standpoint, was a disaster for the communists. It basically eradicated the indigenous communists in South Vietnam. But what it also did, it was played up as a strategic defeat for the U.S., and to that extent, there was such a swing in popular sentiment at that point that, from a personal standpoint, I think everything after the middle of 1968, including the 1968 presidential election, was really a matter of getting out of Vietnam.
The politics of the war were never clear. The goals and objectives in Vietnam were unfocused and without clear-cut direction. Many began to wonder if there were any plan at all.
I don't think the objectives in Vietnam was very clear. We simply fought from day to day. We would go in and take certain areas. A week or two later, a month later, you go in and take it again. We take it and evacuate it, go in and take it again. So the objectives weren't very clear. You just fought.
There's a lot of things going on over there that people don't realize. It was a political war, is what it was, whether people want to accept it or not.
In war, you're given orders to win. Had we been given that type of order, all the military forces are in Vietnam, the war would have ended, in my mind, a year, 2 at the most.
It didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the war really wasn't supposed to be won. And I feel real strong about this. In fact, I get kind of upset about it sometimes when I get kind of emotional about it. Because I had a lot of friends. I brought my best friend home in a box right here in Olympia as a result of that.
And there's a great amount of bitterness among some of the Vietnamese that had supported us to this day. The notion that basically, we sold them down the drain on the thing.
because we knew that we were going to pull out of this area or that area, and those people were, you could just see the tears in their eyes and the pain in their expressions, knowing that they were going to pay the price for having befriended the American forces or the South Vietnamese forces.
Besides the daily management of the war coming from Washington, D.C., some wondered if those with a financial stake in the war had anything to do with the conflict dragging on.
And it didn't take me long to figure out that there was a lot of people making money off that war over there. There was a lot of people with contractors over here. And then you could see after we'd secure the area, we'd pull back for a couple of weeks or so, 2-3 weeks. The communists would take it over again. And then there was a big campaign to reclaim that land again, that real estate. And there was a lot of contractors working over there, a lot of companies making a lot of money, rebuilding all the fire bases and all the installations that we blew up, trying to reclaim and resecure it. And there was certain people in the government that had a lot of stock in some of the helicopters that we had, helicopter companies we had over there. And we lost a lot of aircraft over there. And that was a lot of replacement aircraft. They keep shipping them in. They weren't over there with us to see the people that were dying, not only on our side, but the Vietnamese people themselves.
But for the helicopter crews, the most frustrating aspect of the politics of the Vietnam War came on the battlefield.
Our commanders' hands were really tied over there. They couldn't really do what they wanted to do, from what I've seen as a pilot.
There was an inconsistent and varied policy in Vietnam that helicopter crews could not always return fire when they were fired upon.
If a person's shooting at me, I'm not going to ask whether they're friends or not because, you know.
A lot of restraints on them, a lot of rules of engagement. Never really kind of like going into the boxing ring and having one hand tied behind your back. You know, go represent yourself well, fight hard, but we won't quite give you all the tools to do the job or release that other arm.
It was hard to obey orders, hard to not open fire when the aircraft was attacked.
The first trip, if you drew fire, it wasn't friendly fire. You know, you fired back.
But it got to the point where even as a pilot, and you've probably heard this from other pilots, that when we got fired on, we weren't supposed to fire back until we called and got permission to fire back, which is absolutely ridiculous.
It was even more difficult to hold fire when American troops on the ground were under attack.
I was in an AO where we had Arvins as the commander of the AO. So you couldn't fire in there unless you got approval from the South Vietnamese Army. And we saw a engineer company. It was convoying up the road, and we saw the NVA on both sides of this road. And we were screaming and hollering, trying to get permission to fire. And could not get permission from the Arvins to fire. And the company came under attack, and most of those guys got killed. And we were circling up there with 2 aircraft. Could not get permission to fire. We eventually caught them like about 3 o'clock in the morning. The 173rd Airborne Division caught them and ran them into the South China Sea. And they were trying to get away, so we got called out there. I mean, literally hundreds of NVA troops were out in the water, sampans, trying to get away. They didn't get away.
When we come back, helicopter crews put their lives on the line to rescue Vietnam's wounded. Casualties are an inevitable part of any war. Men are shot to pieces. Mortars and landmines blow off limbs. But unlike wars of the past, Vietnam's wounded had a chance at survival, a good chance. The helicopter used to medevac wounded soldiers out of harm's way came of age in Vietnam. These air ambulances were called dust-off.
The documentation from the medical department that says we are saving more wounded, they are getting medical care quicker, those things tend to sell when you're lobbying Congress for money. Those things tend to sell when people's lives are at stake. So the usefulness of the helicopter as a medical evacuation platform helped to solidify its usefulness for the Army, period.
But when I thought of how many of my buddies died on my shoulders, carrying them to get them out of the jungle, and I fought in the Pacific in World War II, to get them to medical aid and see them die in your arms or die on a stretcher and so forth of shock or something. But then to be in a helicopter, which to me is the greatest mode of transportation today, because we could now take these same people, even friend or foe, and get him to a medical supply or medical rehab point without any trouble whatsoever, and they survive. And to see the survival rate was unbelievable, to see what you could do.
The medics and crews who flew these missions risked their own lives to save their fallen comrades and enemy wounded alike.
Those guys weren't armed. You know, they went into these LZs. They had personal weapons with them, but they had no machine guns, and they had a bright red cross painted on the aircraft, and yet the NVA would still shoot at them. So they'd take fire and couldn't return it, basically. And I thought that took a lot of guts for those guys going at night. Often at night they'd be making their insertions and extractions, and incredible people.
You take fire light and dust off. The first, when I consider a mission, is actually going out, grabbing the patient, bringing them back to the hospital. We went out to pull some guys out of a mortar registration point. The VC had been, every day would fire into this point to register their weapons and get them sighted in. And there was a unit up there, and we were able to get about 14 wounded out by landing in between the mortar shots. And that was always amazing to me how these guys could load so many patients in such a short period of time. You know, you land there, and before you know it, okay, we're ready. We take off and go. That was a very satisfying mission because, you know, it was timing, and, you know, it was a chance. I thought it up, you know, as it happened. It worked just perfect.
The carnage and suffering inflicted on Vietnam civilians during the war was beyond what many helicopter crews could ever have imagined.
I can tell you one, we were Bammy to it, and Special Forces camp to the west of us. They were under siege, and the VC had taken over. And they'd come into this little village and trying to get food. And so they asked for rice, and they said, well, they'd give them all they had. And they said, well, we're sure you got more, we want it. And they said they didn't, and they just turned and shot 2 little girls. Just shot them right, gut shot. Didn't kill them, but terribly wounded them. So we got the call, then the VC left, and we got a call then on the radio, and it was raining, it was a terrible night. And is there any way we could get medevac out there to get them into Bammy Tuip? So I took one ship, and another crew took another one, and we went out there, and we got out there. And so they immediately loaded these little girls onto our helicopters, and the blood was just terrible. And I'll never, this sounds a little gruesome, but it's a fact. When we lifted up and you tip the thing down to move forward, blood run down between my feet, pedals. But we got back, and they had a little hospital there, and our flight surgeon went with them right to the, spent the whole night, did surgery and everything. And I don't know, 2 days later, he said he was going to go he was making the rounds going down there, and I went with him. And the look in the eyes.
Even heavily armed gunships could become makeshift air ambulances if no medevac was available.
We had a call that a Army convoy had been ambushed in the Zook Me Pass. We were a light fire team, which was 2 Charlie model gunships. And we went out there. The captain that was in charge of the convoy was pretty desperate. He had some people down there that were wounded real bad, and we had no slick support or medevac support at the time. I was too heavy to go down there. I had too much armament on board. So one of the first things I did was salvo my rockets. I probably had, 14 pair come out all at once, and I thought the aircraft just stopped flying. It just about stopped in the air. We landed, and they loaded about 5 people on board. 2 or 3 of them had lost an awful lot of blood, missing limbs. We got to the hospital pad at Cameron Bay. They came out, and probably 5 minutes after we landed, we ran out of fuel.
But even the best intentions of flight crews would not always be enough. Helicopter crews were often given the difficult and gruesome task of airlifting the dead from a battlefield.
something that most guys will never forget. When we landed at an area that had had a heavy firefight earlier, and they put a couple of troops in body bags, and we landed, and I remember watching them carry them over and put them in the back of the helicopter. And it was very quiet on the intercom. The crew chief, door gunner, and aircraft commander, and myself weren't talking at all for a while, because when you're new in the battlefield and you see your first casualties and they're Americans, it really brings it home. You know, this game we're playing out here is for keeps, and these guys have given their full measure.
There was one night that we hovered over the jungle because there had been a platoon that had been overrun close to the Cambodian border. We took about 19 or 20 rounds that night. They hovered there and they put the bodies in a cargo net when we winched them up and took them in. The first load we got with a penetrator, and there was 12 of them, and they had all been shot, you know, through the head. It was a real nasty scene, and the crew chief, the flight engineer, I should say, I had to really credit him because the poor kid that was a gunner was the first or second day in country, and he just, you know, every time they would pull one through there, he would have to go to the front door and chuck. So that night, we couldn't walk back through the airplane because it was just a mess.
One of Vietnam's ironies is that everyone who fought there felt that everyone else had the really hazardous duty. But everyone agrees on one thing.
The American soldier in Vietnam, particularly the infantry, American infantrymen, was by far, in my mind, were the true heroes in Vietnam. If you want to identify a person that was a hero, they did all the things that one needs to do.
Helicopter crews witnessed firsthand the suffering and the bravery of the grunts, the infantrymen.
I think the number one thing that people don't understand about the military is that in a war, it isn't the John Wayne thing where the battle starts, you go through this horrendous experience, then at the end of the battle, you go back, salute your commanding officer and say, gee, job well done, you're going back to New York to Times Square. It doesn't work this way.
When the grunts were in trouble, every man and every aircraft knew that going to help them was of the highest priority, at whatever the cost, orders or not.
To me, that was the only reason I was there. You'd see these youngest, you know, they seemed so young to me. I was a little bit older than the crews around me and whatnot, but they just seemed so young to me. And they were just guys we'd do anything for.
You'll go this horrendous experience and you wonder how you made it through the day. And you're going to do it again the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And you're going to do it 300, 400 times. And it's absolutely, it's emotionally amazing that these guys stayed together. The image is having all the support and everything is crazy. You had these guys spread all over Vietnam in small groups, and you didn't know where the enemy was going to show up in mass. You kind of had a vague idea, but you were just hoping the intelligence was right and that you had support.
To me, as an old infantryman, the beautiful look on them kids' faces when you come out and they're tired and beat and what have you, and you're going to pick them up and retrieve them, and you just see that if there's any spark left in their little bods, it's when they look up at you and say, "Thanks for showing up, Chief."
Back at base, helicopter crews had a few precious moments of peace, a chance to escape the war and think about home.
We had tapes that I would send back and forth from my family to stay in touch with them. I wasn't too big on writing, and a lot of times you didn't have too much time to write, so I would tape a message at night and send it home, and they would tape a message and send it back to me. So you look forward to that kind of stuff too, and with your family.
I was single, and I think I think I would have had problems if I was married.
I basically rode home every day.
To escape the relentless fatigue and stress of combat, crews had to earn the right to go on R&R, rest and recreation. Individual units all had their own criteria for it, like time in country or number of sorties flown, or visible battle fatigue. There were brief in-country R&Rs in Saigon and Vung Tau, but the best was the week-long leave when they sent the men to Hong Kong, Bangkok, Thailand, Sydney, Australia, or even Hawaii. Most of the married men wanted Hawaii so they could meet their wives and families there. Most of the single guys didn't really care where they went, as long as there was women and good liquor. But the one thing everyone waited for in Vietnam was getting short. A soldier's year-long stay in the war was almost over.
You might remember the last 2 weeks in Vietnam, they tried to put you down. You didn't fly, you know, you did administrative things, you got ready to leave and so on, and just if you lasted that long and didn't get injured or whatever, why they tried to give you some time to have some downtime.
Getting short even had its own anthem.
We got to get out of this place.
If it's the last thing I ever do.
But I remember when they'd play that at a club, or the hooch we designed as a club or whatever, everybody would stop there with their room and sing it the loudest they could.
That was it.
When I hear that song now, I kind of get goosebumps.
We gotta get out of this place. If it's the last thing we ever do, we gotta get out of this place. Girl, there's a better life for me and you.
When we return, the pilot's journey from one war to a war of a different kind, homecoming. Homecoming, a year of bloody battles, lost friends, and never-ending fatigue was over. Helicopter crews, as all servicemen in Vietnam, returned to find their country in turmoil, a nation raging and rifted. After the most trying combat conditions imaginable, the servicemen returning home felt they had served their country well. But no one at home seemed to notice or to care.
Between my tours, I was back at home, that's where my family was. I guess I could, in those days, could count on the fingers of one hand how many even asked me where I'd been. And so that was hard.
I went to community college when I came back, and I saw a North Vietnamese flag hanging in a window of a college classroom, and I actually went into a classroom and went over and ripped the flag down before I was asked to leave. I just didn't feel it was appropriate at the time, and it hit a nerve.
And you came back and nobody asked you a question about it. Nobody said a word about it. It was kind of like it didn't exist. And I never got anybody doing any hate, evil stuff like you're a baby burner or anything like that. What I got was just people ignoring you. They just totally ignored this aspect of your life. You're a great guy, but they never mentioned that you were a vet.
Only two people had short hair back then, as cops and people in the military. I grew my hair as long as I could.
Nobody appreciated what we did. I mean, we became the enemy to our own people, it seemed.
All I wanted to do was go home, you know. Nobody ever spit at me. I would have knocked their face off if they did, but nobody ever did anything like that. However, I do know that if you talk to anybody, they'd give you the old spiel that how they just didn't like us. Even though you tell them, well, I picked up wounded, they still didn't like you.
I don't think I blamed anyone, and yet I blamed everyone. We just simply tried to dismiss it. And I think that's probably what causes all of the pain now, is we weren't allowed to grieve. We weren't allowed to go in and sit down and have people say, we're very proud of you for what you did. And maybe they shouldn't have. So we sort of had to suck it up and keep going. Some of us were able to do that. Others were not. And we see them on the streets every day. The homeless, people out of jobs. They just couldn't handle it. I mean, some of these people just went off, well, you know, went up in the woods and just stayed, wouldn't come down.
Many returning veterans found they had to pay a price at home as well.
And of course, my marriage had failed, you know, like a lot of guys, and that, you know, I think I was absorbed with it when I came home for quite a while, and it took a lot of years to get over it. I lost a lot of real good friends over there.
My view of Vietnam now is that we shouldn't have been there. We shouldn't have been there, and we probably did some things over there that we should not have done as soldiers and as a service, and indeed maybe even as a nation. But I think the objective was pure. The goal was pure. My great disappointment with Vietnam is the fact that we didn't win it, and I think we could have. And we didn't lose it in the field. We lost Vietnam in Washington, D.C.
58,715 Americans died in Vietnam. Of those, 4,339 were helicopter crew members. The rest were lucky. But in a strange way, even those who came home gave their lives to that war. There hasn't been a job interview, an introduction, or a relationship that hasn't somehow impacted since.
At the time, I wondered, you know, why all of this, you know, for nothing, you know, all these guys that we lost for nothing. It seemed like nothing, but if they say go in the military, you go. But after you see what happened over there, you know, you wonder why. You know, what all these people are gone for no reason. You know, I guess there was a reason, but I can't find it.
At Fort Rucker, Alabama, there is a somber monument to the helicopter crews who died in Vietnam. For those who lived, the names of their fallen comrades are not just etched in stone.
Tom was from Toms River, New Jersey. I was from Cherry Hill at the time.
One Officer Worth, W-R-T-H.
A.J. Bottom and Bob Strange.
He was one of these guys that just chomping at the bit to fly gunships.
Steve Chasen.
My best friend all through high school, Gary Mack.
And I told Tom, I said, Tom, you know, I'll stop by and say hello to your mom and dad when I get home, tell them how you're doing.
I'd just rather not talk about it.
So I got home several days after that. I finally made it back home. And about a week later, I finally made it down to Toms River, New Jersey, which is probably an hour and a half away from me.
Sam Toomey, Independence, Missouri.
And I knock on the house, his door, and his mom answers the door, and the first thing that hits me is the smell of flowers, a lot of flowers. 4 days after I had left, he was with our gunship platoon leader, Captain Michaels, and they were on a combat assault, and pretty much got the tail rotor blown off, and they went in doing about 90 knots inverted. And Tom lived. 3 or 4 days later, he died.
But from the ashes of war comes hope. Many helicopter crew members turned their training and service in Vietnam into something positive.
One of the things that I love is that the military gave me, and my experience in Vietnam was it gave me the ability to do what I want to do. And this has been a wonderful job here at Life Flight. We can take some skills that were once put to use for destruction and turn them into a life-saving mission. And I mean, what better thing could a guy ask for, you know?
And every man, every teenager who flew helicopters in Vietnam and came home has an understanding and appreciation for life that few will ever know. To see them now, you wouldn't believe that they could ever be that young or filled with such fire. Now, most of them are in their early 50s, graying and out of shape. In a suit or out on a Saturday morning mowing the lawn, they just look like anybody's dad. Today, many of them have their own teenage kids, unbelievably with skateboards and baggy pants, the same age as they when they went to war. The Vietnam War will be remembered for many things. It was an intense jungle war, the war to stop communism, the war that tore America apart. For most Americans, this horrific visual tapestry was experienced through television. Images seared in our consciousness of jungle skies filled with American crews aboard the war's most enduring technological marvel, the helicopter. But for the helicopter crews of Vietnam, the war was something so much more. It was a personal experience.